Our topic today is asexual reproduction. Organisms that use asexual reproduction use a process called mitosis, which some of you may be familiar with. Organisms that use asexual reproduction have only one parent. The offspring are identical to each other and also identical to the parent. So what that means is they have the same DNA. We've already talked about DNA a little bit. So if they're identical to each other, they're going to have the same DNA. When we talk about sexually reproducing organisms, we can get that similar kind of feature by having twins. But in this case, organisms that reproduce asexually, all of their offspring traditionally are identical to each other. There are many different ways to carry out asexual reproduction by using mitosis. So some examples include a process called binary fission. Some of you may be familiar with the word or the prefix bi as meaning two. And that's really what happens. The cell is going to double in size, copy the DNA, and split itself equally in half. And when it does that, it's also going to divide the DNA in half so that each of the offspring gets an exact copy of what the parent had. So for an example, we have organisms like amoeba. Most single-celled organisms carry out binary fission, and amoeba is one of them. Bacteria, paramecium, those are also examples of single-celled organisms that carry out binary fission. So we say that this would be our what we call a parent cell. That parent cell is going to copy its DNA and make a duplicate of it, and then it's going to split itself in half. As it splits itself in half, it's also going to divide up organelles and DNA, and we have two identical daughter cells, or organisms, as they're sometimes called. Another process that uses mitosis for asexual reproduction is budding. Unicellular organisms can carry out budding, and traditionally we would then have an uneven split of the cytoplasm. An example of an organism that carries out budding that's unicellular are yeast, just like the yeast that you use to make bread. These yeast, as they carry out budding, would have this little offshoot that would start to, just like a little bud on a tree almost, would start to grow off to the side of it. Eventually, that little offshoot would split off, and we would have our parent cell and the daughter cell, and eventually they would grow to full size, to be the same size as the parent. The idea is that they have the same DNA still as the parent does. If a multicellular organism carries out budding, we would have one parent cell that would create a bud, which would develop into a new organism. An organism that carries this out traditionally is a Hydra. A Hydra is a relative of a jellyfish. It kind of looks like this tube with little tentacles at the end. They're found in freshwater ponds. And that Hydra would have a little offshoot starting to grow off of it. Some people almost kind of refer to it like a mini-me. And that offshoot is identical to the parent, and when it gets to a certain size, it will break off, just like the yeast had its bud break off, and grow into a full-size Hydra, identical to the parent, identical to each other. Some more examples of organisms that use mitosis for asexual reproduction and processes. The process in this case is called sporulation, and this is used typically by fungus, and they create something called a spore, and that can be used to create a new organism. Basically, a spore is just DNA surrounded by a tough outer coat. You could think of bread mold. We would have these spores in the air, and when the conditions become right, that spore can then spawn into more bread mold that would be growing on your bread when the conditions are nice and moist and warm for it. The offspring are identical to the parent, identical to each other. The interesting thing with fungus is they can create thousands of spores all at once, and they're all identical to each other in the parent. Another process that uses mitosis for asexual reproduction is regeneration. This is finally getting to be a little bit more complex. Notice most of these things were relatively simplistic so far for asexual reproduction, and now we get into something like regeneration, which with regeneration, we are replacing a lost or damaged part, and it gets regrown. Typically, this is done with invertebrates, things without a backbone. So things like worms typically can do this, and starfish. So this is a type of worm called a planaria. And a planaria, and some of you may be familiar with worms, can be cut in half or partially cut so that it forms a head and a tail end. Over a period of time, it will regenerate or regrow the head from the tail end and regrow the tail from the head end. It will form all of the parts and all of the things needed that were in the head and tail end, so that we have two new organisms eventually that are identical to what that one parent was originally and identical to each other. Starfish can also do the same thing. The interesting thing about starfish we know typically live in the oceans, and if one of what they call arms of the starfish gets cut off, if it includes some of that little central part or central disc, that one arm can then regrow all of the rest of the arms to go into a completely new starfish, identical to the parent and identical to the other one that lost its arm, which would then also regrow the arm that was lost. Some people have also done research where they've cut the starfish almost into a pizza, and as long as it includes enough of that central region where most of its nervous system is, each of the arms would then grow into a fully functioning starfish with all of its arms, and they would be identical to each other and identical to the parent. Another complex organism that can carry out regeneration happens to be, some of you might be familiar with lizards. They can regrow a tail. They've also found that salamanders can regrow an arm, or a leg if you would call it. If that leg happened to have gotten cut off or bitten off by a predator, they can regrow all of the structures within that leg. Bones, nervous system, they can regenerate the muscles. And it's not just scarring over, they can regrow the whole leg. That's the most complex version of regeneration that we know of. This is all done, remember, by mitosis. The offspring are identical to the parent and identical to the other daughter cells or each other. In this case, we have no genetic variation. So some of the organisms, you would think that maybe they would be different, just like sexual reproduction, but they're not. They're identical to each other. We'll talk about how they maybe can manage to get some genetic variation. But unlike humans, where brothers and sisters and cousins and whatnot are all different from each other, all of these organisms reproduce by a process called asexual reproduction, creating identical offspring. There's another type of asexual reproduction that plants typically use, and it's called vegetative propagation. It's a type of asexual reproduction in plants. And remember, this again is going to use the same process of mitosis. And some of you that might be familiar with plants, if it's carrying out vegetative propagation, we're not using pollination. So the pollen is really a form of sexual reproduction in plants. In this case, it's asexual. We're using mitosis. We're not going to be pollinating. So there are natural types of vegetative propagation. And the first one would be tubers. Tubers, example that you might be very familiar with, are potatoes. If you've ever left potatoes in a closet or out in the bag or in the garage, wherever you might store them for a longer period of time, you notice the small eyes that start growing out of the potatoes. Well, those eyes actually, if you cut the potatoes so that each piece had an eye, put it in the ground, put it in the dirt, would grow into an entire potato plant all by itself. Each of those offspring would be genetically identical to the original potato. That's a natural method. Another example are bulbs. Think of the bulbs that you might plant in the ground for spring flowers like tulips, daffodils. The bulb grows underground. The bulbs are actually another process of vegetative propagation. Another common example that we think of when we think of early summer, June, are strawberries. Strawberries do what we call runners. They have runners. They have these little shoots or stems that run on the surface of the soil, and eventually along each of the parts of the stem there are these little nodes that can shoot out roots into the ground, and it will grow into a new strawberry plant. Spider plants also do something similar. So these are above ground stems that will grow, called runners. Rhizomes are another example of natural vegetative propagation. One example of rhizomes would be poison ivy. Poison ivy have stems that grow underground, very similar to the strawberries, but instead of being above ground, they're underground. Irises also grow in this manner. So those are our natural methods. We can also have artificial methods of vegetative propagation in plants. And there are three main ones that we're going to discuss. The first one being cuttings, and it's exactly what it sounds like. You would cut a piece of the stem off of the plant, replant it. You can either put it in water or soil, and a new plant would grow from that cutting, genetically identical to the parent. So you could do this with tea, blackberries, almost any plant you can manage to use a cutting, especially if it has soft stems. I'll show you some in class that we can do that with. Another example would be grafting. You can take a plant of a similar species and attach it to another plant with its roots. So we can do this with citrus trees. I can take a graft or a stem from a lemon tree, attach that to a lime tree, and that lemon tree would then grow attached to the lime tree, and the lemon branch would grow lemons. The original part of the lime tree would still grow limes, but they would be growing together. They maintain their own DNA. They would be identical to where the parent came from, so that's why that lemon would still grow lemons on it. Layering. The next one is layering. Layering is pretty interesting because you can take the stem of the plant, and just like we were able to do a cutting before, we can now take that stem, and instead of cutting it off, we could layer one of those little nodes, almost looks like a bud, under the soil, and that plant would then start to grow roots and can grow into a completely new plant, genetically identical to the parent. You could do this with roses and all sorts of other bushes. So we have an above ground portion growing roots underground, and eventually you could snip it and cut it from the parent. So this is an example of what you could look like for layering. Now we've been talking about mitosis, but we really haven't talked about what it is just yet. We've been getting into the asexual reproduction part of it. In terms of mitosis, it's a type of cell division, and it's used for various things: asexual reproduction, growth, and repair of dead cells. So multicellular organisms use mitosis in order to grow new cells and add new cells to become larger multicellular organisms. And we can also use it to repair dead cells. So just because we're a multicellular organism that carries out sexual reproduction in order to reproduce new offspring, we can also use mitosis within our bodies for growth and repair. During mitosis, DNA is going to replicate or make a copy of itself, and the cell would split in half. In the end, we end up with two daughter cells, just like we saw with binary fission. They are identical to the parent and identical to each other. Remember, again, we have no genetic variation. Remember, we have no variety, no differences. Remember that DNA is our hereditary material, and it's organized into chromosomes. We're going to see this later on when we look at the steps of mitosis. Our normal amount in a regular body cell would have what we call 2N chromosome numbers. So N represents the number of chromosomes that we have, and it just so happens that in our normal body cells, we have 2 copies of each of those types of chromosomes. It happens in humans. We have 23 different types or kinds of chromosomes, and we have 2 copies of each. So our 2N number happens to be 46. We have 23 types of chromosomes, 2 of each to get 46. We also call this number the diploid number. Remember, again, di means 2, meaning we have 2 copies of each type. This is going to be important as we talk about the process of mitosis and eventually when we get into the process of meiosis.